Welcome back to the Whispering Hour, where the world sleeps, and stories wake. Before tonight's tale begins, don't forget to like the video, comment where you're watching from, and tell us what kind of stories you would love to hear next. And subscribe, so you'll be here when the next story wakes. Now, let's begin. It was the kind of night the city forgets exists, the shops closed their eyes, the loud intersections thinned to whispers, and the subway station sat like a bedside lamp left burning for someone who might come home late. I had taken the night shift at Platform 3 because the manager trusted me to be steady and because the money was better than any other late-hour job I could find. I liked the rhythms of the station, they were ordered, dependable. Trains came, trains went, lights blinked on a predictable schedule, and the occasional late passenger gave you a story to tell the next morning when the yard crew joked over burnt coffee. That routine gave a man a kind of peace. Or it used to, until the last train that should have been empty pulled itself along the rails and carried something inside it that felt like a shadow wearing the shape of a person. The announcement board blinked its routine message, soft digits and fluorescent calm. Train 2479 was due at 1:27 a.m., a deadline run, no passengers logged, a test carriage rotation the maintenance crew used to keep cars moving and parts warm. I'd waved at empty windows countless times because the habit makes a place feel like it notices you back. Tonight, the display said all the same things, only the air felt tighter, like the platform had folded slightly inward, watching itself. There's a small difference between quiet that comforts and quiet that waits, and I could feel the latter without understanding why. Maybe it was because the hum of the rails came earlier than usual, a low vibration that didn't belong to metal alone but sounded like something waking under the concrete. Maybe it was because the overhead lights flickered once and held, a half-blink of the world. I can only report the way my skin knew before my mind did. When the headlights first bled through the tunnel, they showed a train that looked wrong, at least to the eye conditioned by thousands of ordinary nights. The windows glowed with a warm, candle-tinted light instead of the harsh bluish bulbs they used in service cars. Behind one of the windows someone leaned forward. Not a face in the casual reflection I saw most nights, not a maintenance tech glancing up, but a posture that read intent like a headline. The figure was oddly still at first, then when it moved, all motion lagged by a breath, as if time had decided to delay the body's obedience for a second. The hand rose, flat against the glass, not frantic, not pleading loudly, but placed there with the calm of a person who has been practicing a small ritual for a very long time. There's a reflex on nights like that, you call it in, you radio through the routine check, you speak into the radio to make the world normal again. Control, Platform 3. Train 2479 approaching, I said, the word standard, automatic. The voice on the other end kept its even tone. Copy, Platform 3. 2479 normally closed. No passengers. Good. That's what the log said. That's what the night crew had scheduled. But as the rails sang and the train slid past our platform, I watched the face come into the light. Those lips moved, slow and deliberate, and though the station swallowed sound like an old house swallows whispers, I read the shapes they made. A single word. The sort of word that settles into your ribs when you learn its meaning. Help. It's worth being honest here about what I felt next, a taut, ugly electric thing that tightened my chest, the animal brain déjà vu that has let caretakers and watchmen survive for centuries. I did the sensible things a minute later. I radioed again, louder this time. Control, the train, there's someone on board. Static answered, then that standard calm voice again. Platform 3, confirm. All cameras green. No passengers on 2479. It passed through normally. But I saw, words fell short. If a man has been at a deadline station long enough, he learns that what he sees and what the logs show are two different governments of truth, and neither one is wrong until they disagree in a way that matters. I kept my radio clutched because the radio is an anchor. At least voices tie you to the people who will check your work when the morning comes. After the train vanished into the tunnel, the platform felt colder than the night before, the kind of chill that isn't about temperature so much as the place remembering you. I walked to the edge where the train had been closest and stared down into the tunnel until the darkness flattened my face. Then I saw an object on the tile, half caught in a flicker of the emergency light. I bent and picked it up. An old ticket, the paper soft where 9 years of handling had left it fragile. It was stamped with a date I recognized, not because it meant anything to me personally, but because the Public Transit Museum down the road had a display with old tickets from that era, and it lodged in the mind. Car 4, seat 23, scrawled in a hurried hand across the back, still on board. Don't let it pass again. If you keep watch in any station for long enough, you learn that paper forgets less than people do. Someone had written a warning on that ticket. Someone had left it behind like a breadcrumb, and it had found my shoe. I felt the station tilt in front of me. Suddenly schedules and budgets and routine signs felt like props in a play where something else was directing. The clock on the wall said 1:54. The train's rotation would bring it back around past platform 3 at 2:11. An hour is not much in a city, but an hour can be everything to whatever lingers between rails, so I did what any sane night person does. I made a list in my head, small and practical. Check cameras, note footage, get the maintenance crew involved, stay visible on the platform. The last part was something half superstition, half practical. Empty platforms get strange news. The cameras showed nothing unusual, not at first. A frozen grid of normalcy, fluorescent lights, empty seats, a janitor's cart in the far corner, the warp of a microphone speaker. But I replayed the angle near where the train had slowed, inching forward frame by frame until time looked lumpy and wrong. And in that lumpy time I saw what had been obvious to my own eyes, a person inside car 4 leaning so close to the window their breath fogged it, a hand pressed flat. The grabber camera caught the smear as the train moved too fast to let the image remain clear. Then there was nothing. The frame after was empty and clean. The log wanted me to be a clerk and note, anomaly, unclear. But I had read a word on that face, and words are stubborn. The message on the ticket pulled at me the way a prayer pulse lines through the air in an empty chapel, quietly, insistently, don't let it pass again. Who had scrawled that and left it? Why here? The station is a collection of lost things, umbrellas, gloves, worse, lives that move through corridors and do not return. Sometimes the left behind is a small kindness. Sometimes it's a warning. I put the ticket in my pocket as if keeping it close might keep it from being swallowed by the rails. The remainder of the night grew taut. I moved through my rounds with an odd tenderness, checking the intercom, the emergency lights, the platform edge. When the minutes stretched near 2 a.m., the platform felt like a lung readying for a sudden gust. The time between trains is elastic when you are waiting for one in particular, the heart counts differently. When the headlights crawled toward the tunnel mouth again, I stood close to the speaker bank where the sound falls off into a buffer. The train slowed like a live thing approaching, and again window lights glowed with that soft, interior gold. Again a figure came forward. This time I had the ticket in my hand and the grain of the paper under my thumb felt like a small anchor. The person in car 4 looked up at me as if noticing me for the first time, though the lag in their movements made you question who noticed who. Their mouth shaped the same careful syllable, mouth forming help, a small breath of a word. But the eyes were the part that lodged, large, too dark at the center, the whites faint and leaking across the iris like someone had smeared the memory of a face through grease. They held the look for a long beat and then, like paint dragged across glass, the face blurred and the train surged forward, swallowing their hand and their wrist as it vanished. Something thin and pale fluttered off the window as the car passed, and I kept my fingers open as if I could catch the sound. The ticket in my palm burned cold, and I tucked it back into my pocket when the engineers radioed in that the line was clear. They had seen nothing. The cameras had shown nothing after all the frames ran their thin film of reality. All clear, the dispatcher said into the ear. No anomalies. And I lied and said, copy, because I was tired of arguing with footage and logs, and because lying sometimes calms the heart when the world feels untended. I stayed on the platform, though, and listened for the train's return like you listen for a word you hope will come again to explain itself. In the lull that followed, a cleaner asked if I'd seen the show on late-night telly, the sort of program that mines the city for urban oddities and packages them with loud music and grainy reenactment. I gave him the ticket and asked him not to mention anything to the morning crew. His face took on the look of a man who had worked nights his whole life, a mix of tuned skepticism and a tiny, respectful nod for whatever story the city was collecting at the moment. He slipped the paper into his rag and told me to get some sleep if I could, because people who wait too long with their minds on one thing risk thickening the worry in it. I watched him go and felt, absurdly, like the city had palmed me a small duty. Around 3 a.m. the rain started, first as a soft granulation on the platform that made the tiles shine. Rain changes the world at night, makes it more honest, or maybe more rude. It reveals footprints and washes away small details that were never meant to stay. I stood leaning against the steel column and felt the wet cold through my jacket. When the 311 rotation came in, a maintenance crew had to flag it for an inspection. They were young men with the blunt faces of people who have learned to keep their hands ready. They joked too loud, and then, when we reviewed the feed together, their laughter dried up. One of them, a man named Reyes, looked at the display and then set his jaw and said, "We'll take car 4 off service and do a run." That was the correct phrase, take off service. You quarantine the things you don't want spreading. They opened the car with a key that clicked like a small finality. A flashlight beam ran over seat fabric and dirt and the detritus of daily transit. Someone had been in this car recently was clear, a cigarette butt tucked into a seam of the upholstery, a thread of fabric torn from some argument. The beam made dust glow in the air, motes like tired fireflies. We moved slowly because the presence of people long dead in such places isn't an event you want to frighten, it's an errand you want to complete peacefully. When Reyes swept his light across the window where I had first seen the face, the glass reflected only his face and the interior lights. Empty. The engineers scuffed their feet and looked at me like a question, and I handed over the ticket. It came up on the platform, I said. Found it on the tiles. He frowned and handed it to their supervisor. The supervisor flipped it over, read the scrawl, and then slid the ticket down the edge of his clipboard as if it burned. We never had a passenger manifest for any name on this, he muttered, and the words were meant to be final. Still, the man's jaw remained tight. There's a kind of stubbornness in people who keep the trains running. If you don't understand why, you still prefer to act as if you do. So they did the sensible thing. Strip the car and sweep it, lock the doors, tag it out of rotation, log everything. They put a small paper tag on the wrist latch saying "Do not use" in thick marker. But the city sometimes resists being logged. If you watch enough nights you learn that paper and stamp mean one thing, but older things, old grief, loose time, mean something else entirely. When the train shucked past for its next loop at 4:11, it was empty, the monitors agreed, and the ticket sat in the supervisor's pocket. Still, I felt a tug, a small, insistent wanting in the ribs that felt like responsibility. There's a moral simplicity that comes with work like ours. You find something wanting, you try to give it what it asked for. People call it ghost stories and superstition. I call it duty. In the slow afternoon that follows nights, morning crews come with coffee breath and bright eyes and the world shifts back to a schedule. But night had taught me a different rhythm, one where stories are loose things that drift until someone ties them down. The ticket had been such a thing, and while the official tag said "Do not use," the supervisor's pocket and the log books occupy a different truth than whatever moves in a carriage when the lights are wrong. I slipped down into the supervisor's office when no one watched and papered the ticket to the bulletin board above the lunchroom kettle, a small ritual, a warning pinned where the living can see it, a cross-checked note that someone else had seen this, maybe, and left it. When I turned back to the platform, the city was waking in small, cautious beats. A first bus groaned on the avenue, a baker delivered sacks, someone on an early train hummed. The world reclaimed its practical claims. I went home and did what men do who have seen close things at night. I kept busy, I told no one, I double-checked my locks and made the coffee strong. Midnight impressions stick to your thoughts like burrs. You pull them off, but some stay under the skin. I slept in small dozes, unlikely naps between more awake watchfulness. 2 nights later the same ticket turned up again, not on the tiles this time but slipped between seat cushions on a different train that runs a parallel route. The oddity of an object moving through the city like a message tied to the wind started to feel less like a ghost story and more like a letter being forwarded by invisible hands. Whoever left that note had either been trying to get someone's attention for a long time, or the city had some older plan to make sure the message kept finding new pockets. The details become lore: a ticket with a burned edge, the single note written in a careless scrawl. The trains did their rotations, the supervisor kept a careful eye on car 4, and we all did our best to treat the thing like a problem that could be solved with logic. But logic is a blunt instrument when people's lives are involved, and the night has a softer set of tools. If a train carries the dead or the stuck, the only honest thing to do is to act gently, to offer recognition rather than solutions. So when I was back on platform 3 a third night later, I took the small paper and walked, not with engineers or cameras, but alone along the edge of the platform near the track, pausing to touch the steel and set the ticket on the lip of the rail. It's a simple gesture, small and ridiculous perhaps, contacting the place where motion and stillness meet. I left it there as the 2:11 train rolled in, a tiny figure in a city numerator that only the night knows how to read. This time when the carriage's window passed beneath my light I saw something different. It wasn't the pale face with the pleading mouth so much as the hand. The palm pressed cool and deliberate against the inside of the glass, and when the car pulled away, there was a smear, like someone had wiped away tears with the heel of their hand. The ticket remained on the rail. I watched it be swallowed by the motion and then, slowly, inexplicably, the paper rose a fraction, lifted as if something beneath the train had nudged it. It wasn't wind, there was none strong enough. It lifted, then settled again when the train had gone. The station hummed. A rat scuttled. No cameras showed movement. But I had seen the ticket mimic the motion of reaching. That night, I realized with an animal certainty that the note was not simply a warning but a request, and that requests in cities need recipients. What we finally did was small and clumsy and probably useless in the ledgered sense. We scheduled a repair window and asked the dispatcher to slow the train long enough for a crew member to stand at the door as car 4 rolled past platform 3. A human presence might be the kind of honesty the night requires, a witness to say we saw. At 2:11 the train eased, and a maintenance man stepped out with a torch and a kind of impatience that says he trusts schedules more than the thin things that frighten others. He looked into car 4, his torch scanning the seats, and in the shadow of the window he paused. Then he opened the door and spoke, softly, exactly the way you speak to a person who has slept waiting in a hallway too long: "We see you. You can go." The bench of air in the station felt as if it exhaled. For a moment nothing happened because the city likes to measure in pauses. Then, like a small animal freed, the presence in that carriage seemed to fold inward. The hand smoothed itself and the window went clear as the glass had always been. The maintenance man closed the door with a quiet hand and walked back to the platform. He looked at me once, eyes wider than when he had entered, and not saying anything is sometimes the most honest sentence. After that, the ticket stopped appearing. The rails turned their schedule, and the trains resumed their plain rhythm, though something in the station kept a gentler posture as if someone had acknowledged a debt. People came with their early coffee and read the bulletin board and perhaps, passing the pinned ticket, thought of small things they had forgotten to say. The city keeps its ghosts in many forms, some loud and messy, some stitched into the fabric of a daily commute. This one, the last train that should have been empty, taught me something that nights do more often than daylight, that attention corrects the unbalanced world, that a witness matters, and that sometimes an object left in a public place is less an artifact than an appeal. If you ever stand on a platform at night and feel the air fold in a particular way, don't be quick to call it only fear. Give it a look and, if you can, a small kindness. It might be an old request for someone's name to be heard, or the resolution of a small life that got tangled in a machine. The city is an old thing that remembers its debts. And the trains, stubborn as they are, keep a passage open for things that need to pass. I've worked the night shift at the city's subway, interchange long enough to understand that the quiet hours have their own personality. When the last scheduled train leaves and the speakers make that final announcement, the whole place exhales, almost like the building has been holding its breath all day. The echoes stretch differently after midnight, footsteps sound deeper, air feels cooler, and every sound that wouldn't matter during rush hour suddenly becomes something you pay attention to. You start treating the station like a living thing, one that sleeps lightly, listening to itself. And in all those years, following the same routes, checking the same tunnels, watching the screens cycle through their empty platforms, I learned one rule that was more reliable than any schedule: trains don't arrive after 12:45 a.m. Not ever. Everything after that hour lives in silence, in the low hum of electricity settling into the rails, in the dim yellow glow that makes concrete look softer than it is. That's why the night I saw headlights turning the bend toward Platform 4, at 1:23 a.m., long after the system had closed, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like something waking up that shouldn't have. I first noticed it as a vibration under my boots. It was subtle, more like memory than movement, the kind of sensation you initially blame on your own heartbeat. But then the rails lit with that faint metallic shimmer, the one that only comes from something heavy approaching. I glanced at the clock again just to make sure. 1:23, no scheduled maintenance, no late test runs. Nothing. I looked toward the station monitors, half expecting to see a glitch, but the screens showed the same quiet platforms they always did. No arrivals. No departures. That wasn't unusual, the screens always took a second to register movement, but the strange thing was how still everything else remained. No announcement kicked in. No air pressure shifted the way it normally does when a train enters the tunnel. Even the usual hum of the underground ventilation seemed to flatten, like the station itself was holding still to watch. I walked down the corridor toward Platform 4, and it felt like the air tightened the further I went. Not cold. Not heavy. Just concentrated, as if the space was narrowing even though the walls didn't move. The stairs echoed oddly too, each step sounded one beat slower than it should, like the station was repeating the sound back to me in its own time. I reached the platform rail just as the headlights came into view, pale and diffused, more like lantern glow than the sharp beams trains usually have. And then it slid in, silent, impossibly smooth, coasting into place without the usual rattle, without sparks, without any sign of machinery doing work. The brakes didn't scream. The rails didn't protest. The train just arrived like it had been floating rather than rolling. The doors stayed shut at first. I stared at the car number painted on its side, and something about it felt wrong, not the digits themselves, but the font, the spacing, the way the paint looked too matte, too aged, like it belonged to a model that hadn't run in decades. I checked the arrival board. Blank. Completely blank, not even a time stamp error. The overhead lights flickered once, but not in a broken way, more like a long blink. Finally, the doors opened, not with the sharp snap and slide I knew well, but slowly, reluctantly, like someone was pulling them apart with careful hands from the inside. I expected an empty car. What I saw instead made me stop mid-step. 3 passengers sat inside, spaced evenly, each holding something in their laps, each facing forward, each too still for the middle of the night. The first was an older woman in a thick coat that belonged to a different era. The stitching, the buttons, even the muted pattern all looked like something from a faded photograph. Her hair was pinned neatly, in that classic style women wore decades ago. She held a handbag with rounded corners and a clasp I hadn't seen outside museum displays. She looked composed, the way someone looks when sitting for a portrait. But she wasn't breathing. Or if she was, it didn't show. Next to her, a man sat in a gray suit that had the same out-of-time feeling. The cut was too square, the tie too narrow, like he'd stepped out of a decade long gone. A neatly folded newspaper sat in his lap. At first glance, I thought the ink was smudged, too soft, too faded, but then I recognized one of the headlines. A major citywide blackout. One that happened when I was a kid. Another headline below it mentioned a mayor who'd retired before I even joined the department. Pages that shouldn't be new anymore. Across from them, a girl around 12 sat with a metal lunchbox balanced on her knees. I recognized the design immediately, those old painted tin lunchboxes collectors hunt for. Hers had a picture of a cartoon dog that belonged to a show from the 70s. The paint was chipped, but the metal looked oddly clean, like it had been polished recently. Her uniform was stiff, old-fashioned, with a skirt length and collar style that schools hadn't used since long before I was born. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to follow protocol. This is the last stop. Everyone needs to step off. None of them moved. Not a blink. Not a twitch. I walked closer, the soles of my boots sounding too loud in the stillness. The older woman's head turned toward me in one smooth motion, no hesitation, no lag, no natural shift of muscles. Just a single clean rotation. Her eyes locked on mine, not in hostility but in a kind of patient awareness. When she spoke, her voice was soft but layered, like 2 or 3 tones overlapping in a tight echo. "It's not our stop." I froze. Her lips had moved, but the sound felt as if it came from somewhere deeper, somewhere not shaped by breath or vocal cords. The man lowered his eyes to the newspaper in his lap and adjusted it slightly, though nothing on the page changed. The girl's lunchbox clicked softly, just a tiny metallic sound, but the echo stretched far longer than it should have. I tapped my radio. "Dispatch, I have an unscheduled unit at platform 4. 3 passengers. No compliance. Do we have any reroutes or test runs?" After a burst of static, dispatch replied, "Negative. System shows no active cars. Track 4 is clear." I swallowed. "I'm looking at the train. No movement on sensors," they insisted. "Nothing has entered your section." The woman blinked then, once, slowly, like the motion belonged to memory rather than instinct. "We ride until the door changes," she said. I didn't know what that meant, but every part of me understood it wasn't meant for me. I stepped toward the threshold, intending to guide them out, but the moment my foot crossed the doorway, the air changed, pressure built in my ears, a low vibration crawled into my jaw, and my vision warped slightly at the edges. It wasn't painful, just wrong, like stepping into a room filled with sound you can't hear but feel. The lights above flickered again, but only in the station behind me. Inside the car, everything stayed perfectly still. I stepped back. The feeling vanished in an instant. The man finally spoke, voice steady, almost polite. "You shouldn't be here for this arrival." "Arrival?" I asked. He didn't look up. He didn't clarify. He just folded the corner of his newspaper like he was marking a page. The girl opened her lunchbox then, slowly lifting the lid. Instead of food inside, there was a pale fog swirling gently as if it were alive. It pressed lightly against the edges, glowing faintly, and when she shut it again, the latch clicked in a way that echoed across the empty platform like a door slamming far away. Before I could ask anything else, the overhead PA system crackled on, not with the usual announcements, but with a distorted, warbled voice that sounded like it was playing backward through an old tape machine. "Stand clear of the closing doors." I spun around toward the booth, but the windows were dark. No operator. No maintenance staff. Not even the hum of the speaker afterward, just silence, thick and expectant. The doors began to close, but not evenly. They moved a few inches, paused, moved again, hesitated, like they were unsure whether they were allowed to shut. The older woman lifted her chin slightly toward me. "Tell them," she said, "not to wait for who doesn't return." The doors sealed. The car lights dimmed to a soft, muted glow. And then, with no sound, no mechanical jerk, no push against the rails, the train began to slide backward, smoothly, effortlessly, like it was being pulled by something unseen. The tunnel swallowed the headlights, the rails dimmed, and the whole thing dissolved into the dark as if it had never been there. My radio crackled violently. Platform 4 sensors just detected outbound movement. "Are you seeing anything?" I stared at the empty rails. "It's gone." "Gone how?" dispatch asked. I didn't answer. Because I didn't know how to describe a train that moved without entering. There was nothing left on the platform except the faint smell of old metal and a whisper of cold air settling back into silence. I wrote the report the way they wanted, careful language, vague phrasing, no dramatic claims. They said maybe I saw a maintenance rig or misread the time. No one wanted to consider anything stranger. But I know what I saw. I know how the station felt that night, like a place being rewritten by something older than its steel and concrete. Some nights, when I stand on platform 4 doing my rounds, the lights hum in a slightly different key. The air shifts just slightly colder. And every once in a while, faint and distant, I hear wheels on the track. Not coming in. Not leaving. Just passing by in the kind of silence that belongs to things that don't need a schedule. If another unscheduled train comes, I won't step toward the doorway. Some passengers don't disembark. Some arrivals aren't meant to be seen twice. And some trains do not carry the living at all. I kept the notebook on my desk for a long time without writing in it, more out of superstition than purpose. Some things you see underground you don't record because putting them on paper feels like giving them permission to move. The subway has rules nobody ever prints: how to keep your head down when a stranger asks directions at 2 in the morning, how to never sit on the rail even when the station is empty, and how to respect the sealed places with a circle of light drawn around them in your mind. The tunnel I'm about to tell you about had a different rule altogether: a small, stubborn exception shining in the dark: the lights never turned off. Not at the switches, not when power was scheduled to cycle, not when storms took the city down to candlelight. That strip of bulbs on the old maintenance line hummed and hummed, patient and bright, as if someone had decided to watch a corner of the earth for as long as anyone was willing to stand vigil. People joked about it. The older guys said it was a wiring quirk that no engineer wanted to touch. The union calls it an orphan draw. I called it the one place in the system that felt as if someone else might already be keeping notes. I first noticed the tunnel properly because of a sensor alert that made no sense. The system threw up a small flag at 1:17 a.m., an environmental contention usually reserved for smoke or water, and I was the closest technician on duty. The scanner led me to the service corridor beneath platform 3 where the maintenance doors are numbered with blunt, practical metal tags. Each tag carries a record, like a tombstone for some part of the infrastructure, and the one I walked past that night had a tag marked 6C. On paper 6C was a redundant transfer, disconnected for years and rendered obsolete when the newer East Loop opened. On paper it belonged to memory. In the black air under the platform, though, it belonged to the kind of waiting that doesn't have a schedule. The door to 6C was lit at its frame by those municipal sodium lights that usually show only when something in the control grid is off balance, but this light was different, clean and white, not the tired orange of emergency lamps. It cast no shadow and made the steel look new. I hesitated before pushing the heavy latch, which surprised me because I've opened doors in worse places than this. The lock had been chained from the inside with a thin, rusted cable, the kind that suggests someone closed it from within and didn't intend to come back through. The chain slipped free easily enough when I twisted the handle. There was no sign of forced entry. The threshold smelled faintly of dust and something sweeter underneath, like old paper left unopened. When I stepped inside I expected the usual: dust bunched in corners, pigeon feathers, the slow thermal hum that says a place belongs to the city's lungs. Instead, light met me on the step and kept on going, a steady line of illumination that marched down the tunnel in a patient ribbon. The bulbs were small and closely spaced, not part of any modern fixture but rather of an old maintenance rig that someone, long ago, had decided to keep charged. They threw the rail into relief, the sleepers into clean geometry, and the grime into silver. There was no darkness to speak of, no pockets where shadows could hide, which makes the quiet feel stranger. Light often reveals motion, but here it only showed that nothing moved. I walked further in, my boots making a muted sound on concrete, and the scanner at my belt clicked once and recorded nothing unusual. The alert, the thing that had pulled me away from the warm office and into this corridor at an hour when even the rats seemed respectful, had vanished as quietly as it arrived. People talk about places holding memory like it's a poetic idea. I learned quickly it's a practical hazard. Tunnels remember weight, they remember the pattern of footsteps, and if you disturb that pattern, the place notices. I walked slowly along that lit strip, flashlight off because the lamps made its beam redundant, and I listened. The hum of the bulbs was a constant, not mechanical but more like a low voice held in the throat. And then I heard something else, a faint sound beneath the fixture's hum, a chair being dragged. It was small at first, patient as the light, and then it stopped, and I realized that the sound had come from ahead, deeper into 6C, as if someone had been sitting for a long time and then shifted like a person settling to sleep. I kept walking. The figure wasn't visible until I was close. He occupied a position just past the halfway mark of the tunnel, seated on what looked like a maintenance crate, and he was as still as the bulbs. He wore a coat that had once been thick and useful and was now a set of soft plates in the light. He had a cap pulled low, and his hands lay on his knees as if in waiting. At first I assumed he was a homeless man. People get lost and shelter in warm service areas even though they're told never to. It happens, and my training switched on, ask his name, check for ID, insist he leaves because this area is not safe. But when I spoke his shoulders twitched like someone waking from thin sleep. "Evening," I said. He turned his head so slowly it felt choreographed, as if he had practiced moving parts of himself into the right positions. When his face came into the light I understood the wrongness of that tunnel being occupied. He looked familiar to me in the way you recognize a voice at a train station, the echo of a face you had known in passing years ago, someone who could have been a commuter, a courier, a name on a roster. But familiarity doesn't confirm life. His eyes were clear and very still, and when he smiled a small, practiced smile, I had the ridiculous sensation that he'd been smiling at me from the moment I stepped in, that his watch had begun long before I pulled the door. "You shouldn't be here," I said with the politeness we use when asking for cooperation in a quiet place. "This space is closed." He nodded. "Closed on paper," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It fit with the light in the corridor, balanced and calm. "I know. Do you need assistance?" My training insisted on the procedure. "Get him out. Report the trespass. Don't let the city swallow the bureaucratic answer to a human problem." He lifted one hand, then lowered it, and the gesture had a weight to it like a page being turned. "I'm waiting for the lights," he said. "They don't like it when they're alone." I stared at him in a way that is never useful. It lets you believe you can read someone's motive by looking, and the tunnel allowed such mistakes because it was, after all, just a place. People say that when you stay too long in a room you start to see ghosts that are just echoes and not the real thing. I had lived here long enough to know the difference between echo and absence, and yet the man's presence bothered me in a way the motionless bulbs did not. "How long have you been here?" I asked. He shrugged slowly, like a man who measures years differently. "Longer than the schedule knows," he replied. "I came when the lights came, and the lights stayed, and then I stayed too. It's easier that way." "You can't stay," I said. "You shouldn't be in this tunnel. It's restricted. I'll call security." "You can call," he said, and that too was a calm instruction, not a refusal. "They will say the same thing the map says, disconnected, obsolete, not your jurisdiction. They will log something and go home. That's what was logged here last time." He looked past me then, toward the hollow where the rail vanished in a curve. "It's where things keep coming back to wait." I wanted to reach out then and tug his arm and tell him that he could come with me, that there were warmed rooms, coffee machines, the pragmatic kindness of the night crew. I did not. Something about his hands on his knees, the way his thumbs pressed into the leather, told me it wouldn't be simple. People are complicated. Places are purer, they become rules and weights and the thing you're supposed to fix. He stood up with a sound like old fabric and stepped closer, and as he moved the light kept touching him without revealing more than the outline his shape needed. "You're an engineer?" he asked suddenly, as if deciding how he framed me might change what he would say. "One of them," I said. "Maintenance tech. Why are the lights never off here?" He smiled at that, and somehow the smile was an answer and not one at all. "Because," he said, folding his hands, "someone keeps them on." Then he added, as if correcting himself, "not keeps. Watches." The tunnel felt too narrow then with his words filling it. I had 100 rational responses: wiring anomaly, social preserver, city code, but none of them fit the cadence of what he said. Things watched. We use different words for oversight and habit. We don't usually put agency into a bank of lamps. He laughed softly, that same practiced sound, and it had the effect of making the bulbs look too bright all at once. I used to work here, he said, a note of history slipping through the calm. I worked beyond the smell of the paint, where the rails still answered our footsteps. There was a schedule, then there was waiting, and in the wait we made small things permanent, little lights, a chair, a cup. I kept the cup. People throw away cups. People leave cigarettes. Things pile up and collect as if memories were physical. Why stay? I said. Why not go where things are alive? Why sit on the crate? He shrugged again, and this time his shoulders made a small, mortal sound. Because some things do not wish to be left alone, he said. The bulbs, they hum like a chorus. When they remain bright, the hum gives shape to the quiet. It fills the hollow. If the lights were to sleep, that hollow would open, and things would fall inward. So someone watches. It is not heroic. It is stubborn. He turned and looked down the tunnel, and for a moment I saw what he saw, not the physical curve leading elsewhere but a kind of blank that wanted form. The lit strip looked like a spine and the dark beyond like ribs waiting. The man's gaze lingered over it in a way that made me feel like a passerby where a family was mourning. He took a step toward the dark and then stopped as if the thought of moving forward was rude. Some of us prefer to sit with the lights, he said. It is less lonely than the other ways to keep a vigil. I remember thinking then that I should have made a joke, got him to laugh and come back with me. It was the kind of social work we do when no record keeps score. Instead I found myself asking the question that weighs in your throat when something is alive but not living on conventional terms: what happens when the bulb burns out? He gave me a look like someone who knows the answer and will not disturb the mathematics of a system. The room opens, he said. The room lets in what does not want light. The room asks for company. It felt like a metaphor even as it slid past my ears into my skin. I thought of every door I had bolted closed. I thought of reasons to believe in wiring as much as people. The man, who wore time like a coat, watched me watch the lights, and then he did something I didn't expect. He sat down again and patted the crate next to him. Sit, he said. If you are not scared. Pride mixed with curiosity, and I found myself lowering onto the crate. The wood was rough, the splinters arranged like old stitches. When I settled, the sound of the bulbs filling the air became more than white noise, it felt like a language I almost understood. The man folded his hands again and said nothing for a long time. The kind of silence we shared then was not empty. It carried the weight of being witnessed, and there is a difference between silence and the kind of quiet you sit in with someone else. We sat until my phone vibrated in my pocket and broke something that had been building. The message was a routine, a scheduled test on the East Loop, nothing to concern me. In the thin light, even the screen looked like an intruder. I stood up, shook the dust from my palms, and felt the air tighten as if the tunnel noticed a change and wanted to hold on to what it knew. The man's gaze met mine. You will check the log, he said. You will write it down as an anomaly and they will say wiring. You will sleep and in the morning everything will look reasonable. But if you come back, bring a light. His eyes were almost gentle when he said it. Bring your own. I left feeling foolish and heavy. The rest of the night passed under fluorescent brightness and the banal music of the control room. I made the report and in the next day the paperwork reduced the corridor to an item number and a line: unexpected draw, investigate. The union sent a note to the engineering team, dispatch filed an incident in the backlog, and the world pressed forward the way the city always does. I tried to forget the look that man gave me, the simple recommendation that I bring my own light. But memory will not be pressed away easily, it stacks. 2 nights later I found myself standing again at the threshold of 6C. This time the door was slightly more open, and the man waited in the light as if he had known I would come back. He didn't stand up when I walked in, that small practiced smile returned, like the corner of a well-worn page. You brought it, he said, nodding toward the flashlight at my belt though I had not yet clicked it on. "I did," I said. "You told me to." He patted the crate. I sat. The bulbs hummed as if they were pleased by the company. The man shifted his weight and began to talk, not in the telling way of some confession but in the honest, slow delivery of someone recounting the small, precise events that make a life, the bodies they used to move, the nights when the scheduling system failed, the day the map marked the line obsolete and how people trickled away, leaving a few stubborn souls to keep the place neat. "People think if something is out of time, it must be wrong," he said. "But time is only a measure, not a moral argument. Things get misplaced. People get misplaced. If you water the wrong plant every day, eventually it may become the right plant for that corner." He laughed then, a quiet sound like a drawer closing. I could not leave. I had a child once. He liked to watch the lights before he slept. When my shift ended, I stayed an hour. Then the hour grew into another. Then another. The city changed its course and no longer needed that loop. But habits are heavy things and I am heavier still. "What about your child?" I asked, because the question hovered with the weight of something that might have been tenderness or regret. He looked away for a moment, and there was something like grief in the angle of his jaw. "He left the city," he said. "He drove for a while and then moved where the sky was less lit by neon and more by stars. He wrote once. He said he remembered the bulbs like a string of weather. He said they made him calm because they were always there. He never came back." I realized then what the man was really guarding, not the efficiency of an old fixture but the memory of a small domestic shape, the kind of thing that becomes sacred because it is ordinary. A child's bedtime, a parent's return, the pause between shifts. The bulbs were a grid of small promises. We sat. The tunnel collected our minutes in its hum and returned them quieter than reality. I tested the light on my phone, compared the beam to the fixed rows lining the rails, and felt childish doing so. The man watched me with a patient indulgence, like someone who had been rehearsing for an audience of one. He spoke little, but when he did it was with the precision of someone aware that words now are the only tools we have to close out old rooms. "People ask why not move on," he said finally. "They think staying is punishment. They are wrong. Staying is stubborn gratitude. Someone kept these lamps working, long before me. Someone sat when the lamp would flicker, and someone will sit when I am gone. It is a relay, and the city does not notice relays until they fail." I realized then that the tunnel's rule, the one bright exception in a map of planned darkness, was not technological at all. It had become a ritual, and rituals have the power to make places less empty. People had chosen to keep that stretch of the corridor lit, and in the act of choosing they had made themselves responsible for the company that lights bring. Even the bulbs, which most would call instruments, had become companions that refused to sleep. I kept returning after that. Not every night, not obsessively, but often enough to understand that light and memory interact like two bodies around a common center. We orbit, we shape, we keep each other honest. The man's hair silvered at the temples over months I visited, and the way he sat altered with tiny changes of habit, but he never missed the bulb's chorus. He told me things in the half-language of people who have small rituals, the names of the men who used to tighten the screws on those fixtures, the brand of tea someone smuggled and how it tasted when shared, the way a crack on the tunnel wall looked like a small coastline. Once, during a winter thaw, the city cut power unexpectedly for an hour. The control room was flooded with calls, and commuters complained of cold. A dozen trains were delayed. The man in 6C called me, which surprised me, because we usually met by chance, and said only, "The bulb shivered." I went and saw this small army of lights flicker one by one like a field of tiny birds, and when the grid resumed they burst back into patient white as if relieved to be allowed their duty. We stood together through that little power hiccup, and I understood something like solidarity in a place that is usually thought of as machinery. Eventually, and almost without drama, the man stopped waiting alone. He taught another to sit. A woman came one evening carrying a thermos and the folded scar of a chair. She sat beside him and tamped the thermos lid with a careful finger. And the tunnel's hum seemed to approve. The relay widened. More cups appeared on the crate, more voices threaded through the light's steady tone. The tunnel became less a museum of one person's ritual and more a small library of neighborliness. When the man finally left, he gave no dramatic farewell and no one marked a calendar. The lights felt different for a night, as if they missed the cadence of his breath even though it had been years since his presence had been anything but a part of the place. The woman stayed. She kept the vigil and wrote names on a small piece of cardboard tucked into her jacket, names of those who had been and those who had left, small lists of ordinary people whose lives touched that strip of light. She added mine one evening with a pen that trembled only slightly. The city considers the efficient things of its life, schedules, budgets, sensor readings, worth more than the slow, human work of keeping a room recognizable, but that is my bias and the tunnel is evidence that bias can be pleasant company. Light kept a hollow from opening. Bodies kept the light's meaning. The man taught me that the difference between a working corridor and a remembered corridor is not the presence of power but the presence of witness. If you ever find yourself beneath a platform at a time when most of the world has folded in, and you walk into a narrow lane that is stubbornly lit against its context, don't assume it is merely municipal carelessness. There may be a crate, a thermos, a person in a cap and a coat, and a row of bulbs that have been told to keep watch. Sit with them a while. They do not demand much, only to be noticed. In my work I have learned that some remedies are very small, and that is enough to keep a place from becoming a hollow where the city's forgotten things might tumble away. I remember the first whistle because it arrived like a rumor, quiet at first, the kind of thin sound that could mean anything if you wanted it to, and then slowly grew certain enough that my bones recognized it as sound and not suggestion. The system's paperwork calls the place Track 0, which is accurate in the way paper can be honest and still wrong. On the maps it is nothing but an omission, a grayed out stub tucked behind maintenance corridors, but the night crew knows the corridor by other names: Old Storage Lane, the sealed approach, the place where radios go faint if you stand too long. You learn the language of those hidden places by walking them, by noticing the small ways the air behaves. The sealed track holds a different behavior entirely, its silence is organized, and its echoes come back with intention. People tell stories about tunnels to pretend they are safe, which is why when the whistle came through the vents like someone trying to summon a car that had never been scheduled, I didn't at first file it in the part of my brain that keeps track of anomalies. I filed it in the part that keeps track of what feels wrong. My shift that night started ordinary enough: log checks, panel meters, a small cup of coffee that tasted like everything tasted at 3 in the morning. The line above us hummed with its late-night freight, the bright rooms of the control center seemed farther away after midnight, and the under-platform corridors gathered sound like a hand gathering paper. I was on my rounds because a humidity sensor had thrown a blip near corridor H. Nothing urgent, dispatch said, but go check and sign it off. I took the stairs down the way I always did and felt the familiar press of chilled air. The lamps there are functional and honest, they show you the rails, the bolts, the old graffiti like flat postcards. When I rounded the bend toward the sealed gate, however, the whistle reached me again, and this time it was right in front of me, thin and patient, almost musical, as if someone had tuned a pipe to call out a name. The gate to Track 0 was bolted with rust and old chain, and at a glance you would conclude no one had touched it in years. The city possibility of neglect is a convenient thought, we like to believe a locked thing stays locked. But the metal was warm where a palm might have rested. That weight of recent human touch is unmistakable down there, it vibrates in the concrete and shows up on the skin like a memory. I should have turned away then, radioed the gray line and let someone with more authority handle a possible trespass. But the whistle had a rhythm that felt like an invitation or a demand, hard to tell which, and curiosity makes fools of all of us. I eased to the gate and put my ear near the rusted bars. For a moment I thought it might be a maintenance lantern left on the other side, a worker taking an extra break. The light inside was wrong for that assumption. I did not hear footsteps. I did not hear the muffled sound of a human moving through dust. I heard instead a low metallic whisper and a faint tonal overlay of voices, not words so much as the memory of conversation, the way a cassette in the sun remembers who pressed play. When I peered through the bars I expected to see lanterns on stands or the silhouette of a person hunched over a crate. Instead, the corridor beyond the gate held two small points of glow suspended in the dark like floating eyes. They bobbed slowly, up, down, a motion so measurement. Like I could have drawn it with a string and a ruler. Lanterns in the other parts of the system swing because someone carries them. These lights did not swing from hands. They navigated the air as if the air were a track and they were little obedient cars. The whistle came again, softer, and below it there was an underlay of sound I could not place, metallic keys in slow, ghostly motion. Then the silhouette formed, tall and just enough wrong to set a cold ring around my spine. It had the suggestion of shoulders and a long coat, but nothing you could name as human behind the fabric. It tilted toward me, and at that tilt the suspended light swung nearer, brushing the chain with an almost playful touch. I backed away. The radio in my hand felt suddenly absurd and inadequate. When I keyed it, the signal returned me the polite static of a system that did not want to know about things that sat outside schedules. I tried again, and dispatch said the same thing they always say when there is a place not meant to be poked: no active personnel on that track. Stay clear. Hazard protocol in place. There are lines written in the log for those times, and they are designed to displace responsibility. But the gate still hummed with that intimate vibration, like someone had left a radio on low on the other side of a wall, and the wall was listening. The first silhouette moved close enough to press something against the bars. For an instant the metal reflected a smear of light that resembled finger marks, but when I looked again there was no residue. The light had simply shown the idea of a touch. Something odd happens to your sense of time when you stand too near a sealed place. Minutes compress and elongate into the wrong shapes. An hour can look like a glance if the corridor decides to rearrange its mood. I stood there for what felt like a long breath and then a short one, and then the whistle blew once more, with a note that rose then fell like a question. That note carried a feeling: we have seen the living, and now we must call the traveling back. Then a second silhouette stepped into view, and another, until the gate framed a small party of attendants shaped by absence. They did not move as a crowd would. They organized, like a formation learning a choreography. The lantern lights bobbed and floated, and the whole thing felt less like a scene from a horror film and more like some old ritual the track had not forgotten how to perform. There is an institutional vocabulary for these sorts of observations: anomalous phenomena, acoustical artifact, sensor ghost, and it comforts people who prefer explanations to the unabashed impression of being watched. I filed a report the next morning because the world asks for logs, and logs are how the living keep their accounts. But logs fold those nights into columns and omit the felt, and after a while I stopped trusting the ledger for truth. The first night, after the lights vanished as quietly as they had arrived, I kept seeing the lantern glow in peripheral vision. If I moved my head, the light would not be there when I turned. It existed at the edges of my sense, like a story told in a voice I recognized but from which I could not extract the words. I returned to the gate because curiosity, once fed, grows appetite rather than satisfaction. The next night I went with a colleague, someone older who had been on the line longer than me and who felt young to me precisely because he knew to be cautious about what the tracks remembered. He laughed at me first when I told him I'd heard the whistle, like a man recommending sleep. Then he grew quiet when I described the lights. Together we watched the gate until the bulbs cast a dull, stubborn white beyond the bars. He stood with his palms in his pockets and said nothing until a shadow moved that made both of us hold our breath. He used the word attendance then, which at first sounded like a technical term but then took on a shape I understood. The track had its own guests and perhaps its own idea of ceremony. We both felt small in a way that suggested the place wanted something from us we would not be wise to offer. When you repeat a ritual, sit by the gate, note the time, hum a tune in your throat to distract yourself from the silence, you eventually find something else. On the third night I saw more than silhouettes. I saw faces, or the idea of faces, as if a photograph were pressed against the curtain of black and left a faint impression. They were not grotesque, they were tired. The lantern lights hovered in a loose formation, like attendants waiting for orders, and their presence gave shape to forms that stepped close to the bars. One face came near enough that I could imagine the person's life. The way the collar turned up would have kept wind out, the tilt of a head suggested someone who used to listen to engines, the line of a cheekbone belonged to a person who had laughed at least once a day. The idea of a human life inside an erased corridor is a strange consolation and a threat at once. It suggests continuity and denies escape. "Do they step out?" my older colleague asked me in a low voice. The question was practical, because procedures require prediction. The young interrogative is a kind of courage, but we learned together that some questions are better left rhetorical. The lights bobbed and a single thin whistle answered, precise as punctuation. Then, as if on cue, the silhouette nearest the bars raised something that looked like a hand and laid it on the metal. The bars were kissed by the glow and darkened at the point of contact. The first trace of something like residue showed in the shadow, a smudge that gleamed like oil in poor light. My colleague answered the question the way men who have seen hard things answer: "No, they don't step out. Not on our side." There is a small practice you develop on the job to manage the tremors that such nights give you. You make a list of mundane tasks and complete them to see the world as normal again. I inventoried spare parts, checked the pressure valves, tuned a speaker. The flick of a breaker calms anxious thinking the same way counting coins calms the addict. But routine has limits. A week later, the gate was opened by the same width, and the lights were not bobbing but arranged like a procession, slow, sure. The whistles merged into more complex phrases, and the tones matched the frequency of conversation rather than the single note of a stranded horn. I recognized, in the cadence, the restless melody of people calling names. Not necessarily their own names, sometimes they were calling train numbers, sometimes times, sometimes places that no longer existed. It sounded like a family trying to remember what they had once loved. I tried to photograph it once. Phones are both blessed and damned for what they record. They tell truth in pixels but they lie by omission. My picture returned nothing but a smear where the lights had been, a soft white nothing inside a frame of black. The older man liked to say the camera takes what it is allowed to take. He'd tell tales of ghosts done politely, of apparitions that refused to become images. The track's attendance, he insisted, would not be dragged into data shapes it didn't consent to. Now and again, however, a thing happens you cannot ignore because it leaves physical trace. The second week the gate was open and the lanterns bobbed in a neat arc. There was a smear on the chain like a handprint, faint and old. It looked like someone had leaned and wiped and leaned again until the metal was worn smooth where fingers had found habit. In the end, the official process intervened. Someone high up in infrastructure administration noticed an uptick in logged anomalies, lumidity spikes, sensor noise, and, being bureaucratic and efficient, scheduled a sweep of Track 0. They sent young inspectors who had never felt the tiredness of the rails. They arrived with clipboards and bright vests and with confident protocols. They measured the chain, confirmed the lock, assessed the fixtures. They found nothing. They read the 1978 line about unauthorized arrivals, and wrote a note about psychosocial factors among night staff. They closed a ticket and filed it away. The system, in other words, did what the system does best, tidy up. But the tidy up left the smear on the metal and did not account for the taste of the whistle in the mouth. After their visit the attendance intensified. The lantern lights became more numerous and their procession looked like a small migration. The whistle learned phrases that sounded like addresses, and the silhouettes grouped as if rehearsing a departure. One night a shadow lingered so long that sparks flew where its outline almost touched the rail. A small flame, a single spark, nothing that a track inspector couldn't blame on faulty equipment, but when I knelt to clear the spot I found on the ballast a token, the kind of small wooden thing children whittle, a bead perhaps, charred but recognizable as human craft. It was a presence lamp in miniature, the sort of object a person might carry to remind themselves of warmth. I pocketed it, feeling the grain under my skin, and when I turned the lantern lights had drifted closer. The silhouettes watched me with a patient tilt of the head. You learn to talk to people about such nights in ways that make sense to them. The maintenance supervisor wants to know about leaks and gauges, the union rep wants to know about exposure to stress, the control room wants to run system checks. No one asks, in the quiet official channels, whether a corridor remembers the names of those who waited in it. But people do talk in the break room, over stained coffee, and stories travel there like mice in walls. The more we spoke quietly about the lights, the more attendants came, new men and women who carried cups and who stayed seated near the gate for a while. They did not speak much. Ritual has the effect of making human subjects quieter. One of them, a woman with a thermos and a soft laugh, told me that when she first sat and listened the whistle sounded like her own father's voice calling her nickname. That is the sort of detail that unspools belief into obligation. Someone else had their memory attached to the sound and so the corridor was obliged, in a way I am only beginning to understand, to keep calling. Months passed and the presence grew girder thick. The lights multiplied, the whistles developed what I would later call a vocabulary, and the silhouettes began to cluster in formations that suggested waiting more than wandering. On a night when the city above had a storm and many routes were disrupted, the corridor's attendance swelled like a tide. The gate was open that evening and there were more lantern lights than I could reasonably count. They hung at varying heights and their motion was like breath. The whistles sang in harmonies I might once have called music, and as they did, a small miracle happened that had nothing to do with technical possibility. One of the silhouettes stepped so close to the bars that its outline filled the metal with nothing but the suggestion of a hand, and when it withdrew the rust had deepened in a new pattern, as if the bar had accepted the contact and recorded it in the grain. We chose then to stop writing formal reports, because the bureaucracy has only one answer: lock, log, close, and it does not honor the small human things. We watched instead and kept company. People came with extra thermoses, chairs, a stray blanket. The woman who had first claimed the whistle as her father's voice brought biscuits. I remember watching the lights that night and thinking how silly it was that something anonymous could turn a corridor into a home. The silhouettes clustered and moved like a congregation waiting, and we sat outside the gate and kept watch with them. No one entered. No one left. Attendance is its own kind of holy. When the heat of summer arrived the presence thinned in a way that mirrored migrations of birds, bodies moved on, or perhaps the corridor released them because the city called them back to their lives. The lantern lights, fewer now, drifted with the patient deliberation of things that have been ordered to retire. The woman kept the vigil long after the others had stopped coming. She wrote names on small slips of paper and tucked them into the wood of the crate. There were, in the end, more names than anyone could keep in a single memory. She explained, once, that the corridor had become something not of machinery but of responsibility. If you listen, she told me one night, the whistle calls for people, not ghosts. They are simply waiting to be remembered. The city will, in some future year, choose to renovate that stub of track, pipe in a different line, upgrade the sensors, fold the maintenance corridor into a rerouting plan. When it does, the attendance will thin further, and perhaps the whistles will refine to an old tune, then a note, and then little is left but the idea of light. People will speak of the corridor as a quaint oddity, file it under curiosity, and the place will be tidy in a bureaucratic way. But the way I learned to speak of it will not change. Light keeps hollow spaces from falling inward. The whistle was less call than memory in motion. The silhouettes were less agents than witnesses shaped by absence. When you stand near a sealed place and you think you hear a sound insistently human, please remember that not all calls require an answer from the living. Sometimes the right thing is to sit, keep company, and let the place know it has not been forgotten. When you spend enough nights below a city, your sense of what counts as normal changes shape. You learn to treat echoes as if they had character, to feel when a rail is simply being a rail and when a rail remembers weight it has carried before. Trains have habits, tunnels have memories. People, too, develop subterranean mannerisms, the way a night guard sighs into the same coffee cup, the way the control room clicks its switches in the same soft rhythm. Those habits make a map of lived time, and against that lived map there are places that refuse to fold neatly into schedules. Platform 12 folds into one of those places because it keeps the wrong kind of occupant, not the living who let themselves be counted on a ticket or a manifest, but a presence that moves with the train and yet is not carried by it. I first saw the shadow on a night when everything else about the shift insisted on being ordinary: low commuter numbers, the bitter cardboard coffee someone had left in the break room, the dimmed annunciator lights that blinked in ways that made sense to seasoned eyes. The evening had been dull from dispatch's perspective, a couple of station heaters had tripped and they wanted logs filled. I carried my flashlight and the scanner, and the kind of patience you develop for waiting. The station's clock measured hours like sediment. I was checking CCTV feeds for late-night disturbances when one of the monitors hiccuped, just a flicker, and on camera 3 the image stilled in a way that made me lean forward. A carriage rolled past in the feed, empty enough that you could see the whole interior, seats, plastic handles, the pale rectangle of an advertisement that had been there for months. Near the far end, by the second row of seats, there was a dark figure walking. It wasn't leaning, it wasn't drifting, it was walking the length of the car, slow and even, as if rehearsing the motion. At first I thought it must be a maintenance worker's silhouette, a jacket thrown over a seat, an optical quirk. The feed was grainy. The subway cameras are elderly and have moods. I rewound the timestamp, slow-moded the clip, and watched the carriage pass by again. The figure remained. It moved past the window and then back again, pacing as if someone inside had taken to examining the upholstery because the world outside was too expensive to hold. I called it in, professional and calm, control, review feed 3, midnight local, carriage 4, possible trespass. Copy, dispatch said, routine in a way that could quiet panic. Will flag maintenance. Maintenance came with bright vests and clipboards and the sort of cheer that insists there's always a tool for a problem. They checked the platform, the tracks, the carriage list. Nothing. The train log showed a normal run. Maintenance brushed their hands along the seatbacks as if to insist nothing was there. The CCTV engineer rewound the feed and pointed at frames until the blacks of the surveillance made sense as pixels. He shrugged and suggested a bad composite. The reasoned world humored itself and filed the event away as artifact. But artifacts, like old habits, can be stubborn in the dark. 3 nights later I watched another feed and there that shadow was again, this time clear as the dim LED could manage, walking not just in one carriage but in 3 successive cars, appearing in a window and then in another, like a slow-moving stitch in the fabric of the train. Each time the train passed, the shadow moved where no one sat. It walked the aisle like a person searching for their reflection in the glass. It never boarded or exited, it simply paced. When the cameras looped the morning footage there was no sign of crouched figures or sleeping riders. The commuters we do get at those hours were pale, they stared at phones or at the floor. I asked a colleague to watch with me. Because shared seeing dulls the edges of fear, and he watched until his cigarette flared in the break room window and he muttered that the camera had become sentimental. We began to collect the times and places where it showed up, car 4012, car 2107, car 8341. The pattern was like a fever chart, it climbed, then dipped, and always circled back to the same stretch of line. The control room's logs became a map of interruptions, and with each new entry the idea got firmer, it was not glitching, it was repeating. Live feeds, recorded feeds, passenger-captured footage, the shadow existed across formats, which is the kind of thing that makes engineers lose either sleep or their confidence in systems. We formed a plan that was less bold than it sounded: pick a night, ride a carriage, watch closely, follow the movement with the map, and if it appears, do not touch it. Human logic likes to approach the unknown cautiously, because curiosity is violent at times. We assigned the experiment for a week when the trains would be sparse and the stations less clogged with the late drift of weekend crowd. On the appointed night I swapped the fluorescent glare of the control room for the close, warm hum of the carriage interior. My 2 colleagues shadowed me, one operating a handheld monitor and the other carrying a lamp. We sat discreetly at the far end and waited for the slow predictable rhythm of trains that belonged to the network. The carriage rolled past the station that smelled like wet pavement and stale chips, and then stopped where it should. The doors sighed and opened, and a handful of commuters shuffled out. Nobody looked unusual. Nobody looked particularly haunted. I stepped to the doorway, more to stretch than to look heroic, and then I saw movement at the very back of the car. It walked like a person used to an alley, unhurried but deliberate, hands relaxed at its side. The light struck it from certain angles and the lines of it looked like clothing, the suggestion of coat, but the face, when it turned, had a flatness that cameras never quite capture, and yet my eyes could tell as suddenly as a hand on your shoulder. It had no reflection in the window behind it. The glass held the glow of the platform lights and the pale ghosts of advertisements, but where the figure stood the window remained a surface that refused to answer. For a second I felt the whole car tilt toward that absence in recognition. The air had not changed, but everything in me acknowledged a slowness, and the slow is always what frightens people trained to expect timetables. I kept my composure because we had rules. Rule 1, document, don't provoke. Rule 2, if live passengers notice distress, prioritize them. Rule 3, try to avoid defining. The shadow walked past the strap hangers, moved along the aisle, and then paused by a seated man who had his head bent into his hands. It halted exactly at the foot of that man's seat and then, impossibly, mimed the motion of sitting as if remembering the weight of a body on a bench. The seated man didn't stir. He slept the deep sleep of someone who trusts a city to hold them. He had drunk too much and had chosen a poor hour to rest. The figure, after that pause, continued on and reached the carriage door just as the train began to pull away. We followed the movement in the feed as the train left the station and felt the odd, animal sensation that you get when prey moves too close. The shadow's gait had the human rhythm, heel, toe, heel, but it never touched the railings or the floor with tactile decisiveness. It had a presence like steam in a cup. When the train slid into the tunnel and the lights dimmed, the shadow's edges changed, it thinned, as if being stretched by the tunnel itself. Then, as the train curved, it vanished into an aisle where no camera caught a person disembarking, and for an awful, slow second I thought we had conjured something we did not understand. We chased the feed along the line, rewinding and forwarding until the control room smelled like burnt coffee and concern. The event was not unique. People posted clips online, faces grainy and comments quick to joke and then quicker to worry. A practice emerged where commuters began recording, like a rash of small witness statements stitched into the city's chatter. Some saw more than movement, a face that tilted too far one way, a smear of soot where a hand should have been. Others insisted their phones registered nothing, no figures at all. The unsteady convergence of perception and camera is the technological age's curse. Things that exist for some don't always exist for machines, and vice versa. The pattern hardened into a set of rules for how the shadow behaved. It moved in cars that had been lightly used, where the lights were humming in that unsure frequency between bulb and fuse. It walked past sleeping commuters and never disturbed them. It timed itself to passes when the platform was least crowded, suggesting a preference for non-witnessed movement yet also a strange confidence that someone would eventually notice. We began to learn something else too, it didn't like bright attention. When a passenger flashed a phone camera directly at it, the figure seemed to hesitate, to retreat into the train's darker fold. It behaved like someone ashamed, or savvy. When two flashlights crossed paths with it from different directions, it flickered, then steadied as if to recompose. There was a dignity to its motion that irritated the rational parts of us, something that refused cheap spectacle. One night, 2 weeks into the watching, the train's intercom crackled with an unscripted announcement, "Please remain calm." It was a recorded voice processed to be neutral. It was also a voice turned sacrilegious because something in the system had noticed irregularity and chosen compliance over clarity. A middle carriage bled pale light and, without warning, the shadow emerged in the doorway during the stop. It walked into the open platformosphere like a person deciding to step into weather. The crowd gasped as if a trapdoor had opened beneath normality. People shouted, some laughed nervously, some shoved in the doorways, and someone, a teenager with too much boldness to be wise, pointed and yelled. The shadow turned toward him. For one sliver of a second the tunnel held a recognition like the click of a lock engaging. The teenager's camera shook. The feed filled with the blur of bodies and the shadow stepped out into the station and walked along the platform, head bowed as if reading a map. This was the first time we had live witnesses on the platform. We had staff, we had police, and we had a dozen witnesses with shaky footage. Protocol dictates caution, and that caution allowed us time to watch the figure move without reaching for confabulation. The station cameras followed and the shadow kept moving. It paused by a pillar where old graffiti spelled a nickname and stood a long time as if listening for something inside the paint. A child reached out to touch it, the small hand meeting nothing but a cold that left the child's finger pale and shaking. The child had not been hurt by any abrasion, he had been touched by the absence that resembled a hand. People had different readings, some thought it was a homeless man with a trick of light, others said they felt the wrongness in their knees. A retired conductor, one of those people who still wears the job like a coat, approached it with the measured authority of someone who had worked in storms. He called out a name that had been retired in the city records and the figure stopped. The conductor swore later that the silhouette lifted its head and answered with a faint whistle that matched the old train line's horn. When the shadow finally moved away, there was a detail left behind that the cameras could not hide, a single shoe print on the platform, so faint it might have been overlooked, as if something heavy in memory had scuffed the concrete with an absence. For the first time there was residue. It felt like a promise left on the floor. We investigated that print. We cleaned the area, we sampled the dust, we looked for oil, water, anything that might explain a mark. The lab came back with nothing, no organic residue we could measure, no chemical traces. The print was simply a visual indent in the grime. The physical world had furnished us a mark, and the mark refused to obey explanation. The municipal papers had a field day. The corridor's message boards filled with speculation. People debated whether whatever walked the trains was a trick of the mind, a ghost, or a social protest disguised as phantom. There were threads of good faith speculation and others of naked superstition. I tried to avoid the worst of it by focusing, as my training suggested, on pattern rather than panic. But patterns become people in your head when you watch them long enough. You start to imagine motives. You think the figure is trying to tell you something like a child tapping a window with a finger. One night, late when the trains were sparse and the rain made the tunnels smell like iron, I rode alone and watched the doors close at an underground platform. The carriage filled with that small, private quiet you get on late-night runs, the kind of hush that encourages confessions and mischief. I had my notebook out and was trying to transcribe the day's notes when I felt a presence near me. Not loud, not violent. Just the impression of someone standing too close. I looked up and saw the shadow reflected in the glass of the carriage doors. It stood in the corridor beyond the car and yet perfectly aligned with the reflection as if the window had decided to host a memory. It raised a hand and traced the outline of a small child on the other side of the glass. Someone's small fingers pressed from within the carriage and the shape passed without interruption. The child had touched the window and found only a colder, gentler absence than a hand should have been. I felt that absence like a pressure on my chest. I did not move. The shadow's gesture was slow, reverent, like someone rehearsing how to be gentle. It stepped back then and walked the length of the car, not in haste, but as if counting the seats. When the train halted and the doors opened, the shadow moved on and off again and I was left with the taste of something metallic and sweet like a coin placed in the mouth to keep a promise. By then we had begun to treat the phenomenon like an elder might treat a difficult family member, with respect, with guarded distance, and sometimes with a kindness that embarrasses you when you think about it in daylight. People left scarves on seats, small notes, a package of biscuits, a toy duck that someone put at the foot of the seat. At platform T, where an old woman had a habit of knitting and leaving a dropped stitch that she believed would catch misfortune, the shadow paused and picked up the duck with a motion so precise it looked like a practiced retrieval. The old woman cried quietly the way people cry when things are not answered but seen. Because in the end that is what this shape demands, to be witnessed. It moves through the city's veins, stopping at places where a human life was interrupted or overlooked. The shadow crosses the border between carriage and platform at places where someone's goodbye never landed, where a mother had leaned and pulled back her child and never returned. Where a commuter's last shift had ended with no ceremony. It walks with a patience that suggests it is on a route, not a hunt. It carries something like attendance in its motion, and attendance can be a kindness as much as an accusation. Months blurred into seasons and the shadow became part of the subterranean calendar. Tourists asked about it in that sort of airy way that lets people reduce a wound to a story. Conspiracy bloggers made playlists. Children made games of hiding and watching. None of it touched the figure's essential motion. If anything, the attention made it carefuler, more exact. It refined its pathway to avoid rudeness. Once a drunken youth leapt across the doorway and tried to pin a note to its coat, and the figure stopped and looked down with a tenderness you only allow for a person you might have loved once. He placed the note gently on the seat as if returning a favor, and when the boy told the story later, his voice had lost the bravado and gained something like the awe of a ritual witnessed. My colleagues and I argued about what to do with the knowledge. We could have petitioned the transit board for a study, we could have attempted to trap it with cameras and lights, we could have given the phenomenon a name and then a bureaucratic box to sit in. But once you name the uncanny, you risk telling it how to behave. We chose instead to keep a small book at the control desk, anonymously contributed notes from staff, time, car number, a single memory. We did not plaster the pages with commentary. We wrote simple things: child gave it a coin, left scarf on seat. Over the months that book swelled with modest entries and small acts of care. It acted as a ledger that the shadow could not erase because it was held in human hands. There was, finally, an event that asked for more than watching. A commuter, mid-30s, quiet and earnest, fell ill on a train and died before medics could get him out. He had lived alone, a list of overdue phone calls and an apartment that smelled of toast. The car had rolled into a station where the shadow later appeared and paused near the man's seat. People said the figure lingered a long time as if listening. The official line on the report was clinical, natural causes, no suspicious circumstances. But for those who had watched the shadow long enough, the scene took on an extra weight. The figure had come and stood by the man's seat and waited, not to haunt, but as if to keep the man company until someone came, in the acceptable forms, to take him away. After that night a tune worked through the surveillance room. The shadow's motion seemed less like a mimicry of the living and more like a habit of care. You could feel the station's skin relax, as if something that had been nervous finally found its footing. The staff began leaving small things for the shadow more often. People attached small bells to the backs of seats so that if it moved a sound would follow and they could be sure it was safe. The bells chimed a delicate and ordinary music, and for once the surveillance feeds caught footage that looked tender rather than eerie. One evening a man who had been a commuter for 40 years, and who had once been a fireman and treated every tool with religious care, sat with the silhouette and spoke aloud in a voice that did not need the control room's air. He told a story about a train he rode as a boy where the conductor stopped and postponed a route to help a couple who couldn't decide. The shadow listened. When the man finished his tale, he died in his sleep right there on a bench, and the shadow covered him like a coat then walked away. The staff said later they found the man with a peaceful face, and the report read, natural causes. But the man's daughter told us he had been smiling in a way she hadn't seen since childhood. There was a gentleness on the platform that night people couldn't explain except by the way the shadow had occupied the space and kept watch. If this phenomenon answered to any motive at all, it was this: attendance. It was not malicious. It was a wandering kind of ministry that reminded the living that some interruptions require quiet attention rather than panic. The shadow's gait softened around the elderly and quickened when a child laughed. It avoided cameras that tried too hard and appreciated little gestures of tenderness left on seats. Whatever it was, it had become a part of the city's less advertised rituals. People continue to argue about causality. Some engineers claim it's a light-bending quirk at the intersection of old glass and new LEDs. Psychologists suggest mass suggestion and collective grief. Priests have been asked to bless trains. Artists have made installations referencing it. The truth, if such a thing exists for that dark, is narrower and more human. The subway is both a place where lives cross briefly and where some lives end without fanfare. The shadow reminds the living of what the network cannot carry: memory, small acts of kindness, witness. In a city that values movement, the figure values pause. So now when I ride late and the car empties, I watch the windows the way I watch a small animal in a park. I keep a spare scarf folded in my pocket, a piece of stale biscuit wrapped in foil should I be so called to leave it. When a shadow moves through the car I do not shout or reach, I merely stand and watch, and if it pauses, I nod, because there are certain courtesies you owe to whoever keeps an eye on the places no one writes down in their planner. It has kept us from becoming too efficient in our forgetting. If you ever see a dark figure walking steadily down the aisle of a slow-moving train, if it pauses just long enough to remember a seat and then walks on, do something small. Not to stop it, not to trap it, but to witness, leave a coin, or a toy, or a note that says, simply, seen. The subway is full of things that go unrecorded. Sometimes the smallest records, the ones kept in crumbs and thread, are the ones that hold the city's memory together. You have been listening to The Whispering Hour. Tonight's tale fades softly, leaving its last light in the quiet corners of your mind. Let the echoes settle. Let the darkness rest. Good night.